So I'm in the process of rewatching the Fallout TV show, and after starting the first episode, paid a lot of attention to the first scene, the scene that depicts the nuclear exchange between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And today I kind of just want to really overanalyze this scene. Let's talk about what we're seeing in this sequence and perhaps what kinds of nuclear weapons are deployed on Los Angeles in these opening phases of the war. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So, before we jump into this, before people say it, I'm looking way too much into this scene, but I noticed some things that I just kind of want to mention, so I want to get this out there and talk about mainly the kind of weapons we see used here, but a little bit more context for this sequence of events. So let's start with one big discrepancy. In Fallout 4, we see the opening phases of the nuclear war occur at about 9:47 p.m. Eastern Time on the east coast of the United States, with bombs falling in New York and Pennsylvania before the first weapons fell in Boston at around 9:47. A few minutes later, the first weapons hit Washington, D.C. Now, if we adjust for time zones, that's about 6:47 a.m. Pacific time, which is way too early to be having a children's birthday party, and likely in October, the sun isn't even up by that point in time, or if it is, it's just coming over the horizon. Now, we're going to overlook that for the rest of this video, but I wanted to acknowledge that the times don't necessarily line up here, but we don't expect perfection, and this scene would have been a lot less dramatic had it not happened under the circumstances the characters are in at that moment. So let's give a little bit of context to the morning of October 23rd, 2077. The war between the United States and China had been going on for over a decade at that point, and it was coming to a head, with American forces now approaching Beijing as Chinese forces made a desperate last stand around their capital. Leaders of the United States, both economic and political, had fled to bunkers, fearing a desperate last-ditch nuclear strike by China was basically imminent, and that's the environment that we find ourselves in on that morning. But there's a little bit more detail to that. It had become clear to U.S. officials that a strike was underway by this point in the morning, which is likely one of the reasons why there's so much hopelessness. There may have been rumors going around that the Chinese were maneuvering into position to carry out a strike. After all, in the middle of the night, that previous night that had just ended, once again, we're in the morning, Chinese bombers had been sighted in the air over the Bering Strait, making their way towards targets in Alaska, while Chinese submarines had been seen moving into position in the Pacific Ocean off the west coast of the United States. We know along the east coast, similar submarines like the Yangtze were moving into position to carry out strikes against their targets, so it would be clear to U.S. officials that China was at least positioning to be able to carry out a nuclear strike, if not already in the early phases of ending the world. And that, I believe, is one of the reasons why there's such a strong sense of pessimism. Hell, we see the weather reporter that morning basically protesting against giving a weather report because he doesn't know if there will be a tomorrow. The word might be spreading that something is going on, and with the current tension, that's just assumed to be the beginning of the end of the world. But the first sign that our characters see that the war has actually begun is not the activation of EBS or something like that, but a nuclear detonation in the heart of Los Angeles. A single large nuclear explosion by the metrics of what Fallout presents us with for nuclear weapons. This bomb is different from all the others in this scene. It's slower and larger, and this gives me the first clue to where this bomb came from. I believe this is a warhead from a ballistic missile submarine. We see when we board the Yangtze in Fallout 4 that it carries 6 ballistic missiles, each with a single high-yield weapon on board. That would yield one explosion, unlike submarine-launched ballistic missiles in real life, which often carry multiple warheads. That means that this individual explosion, I believe, is from a submarine-launched ballistic missile, specifically one of the Chinese submarines seen maneuvering into position off the west coast of the United States. That's why this initial explosion does appear larger and strangely slower than a lot of the other blasts. Now, one more thing I want to bring up real quick at this point is, yes, if these were real nuclear detonations, a lot of these characters would have been blinded, if not by that initial explosion, then by the subsequent explosions we see later in the scene, which brings me to those later explosions. Now, I think it's safe to say that since these explosions all happen fairly close together time-wise and in a relatively tight formation, These are likely MIRV warheads, delivered by a single ballistic missile which carried multiple independent reentry vehicles. Something that we know is present in the Fallout universe because it's referenced in the name of a variant of the Fat Man that fires multiple projectiles. These warheads generally seem to be of lower yield than the one we initially see, developing smaller, faster explosions, and like I said, they all come in at basically the same time, leading me to believe that they're all from the same missile. Which missile, though? Because we see these submarine-launched ballistic missiles fielded by the People's Liberation Army Navy when we board the Yangtze in Fallout 4, and those are all single-warhead missiles, at least as far as we can tell. So my suggestion is that these are likely from an ICBM. Likely launched from the Chinese mainland and sent towards the United States, flying its 20 minutes or so to deliver its weapons to the west coast of the United States. This would line up pretty effectively with the timeline and positioning we see of Chinese nuclear forces at the outbreak of the war, with the presence of submarines off the coast and a detection of ballistic missiles just roughly 20-30 minutes before this event. And it would also line up with the likely conclusion that a lot of the detonations we see on the east coast of the United States at the opening of Fallout 4 are also from ICBMs, but single warhead ICBMs. Which, by the way, on that same sense, it's likely that the bombers detected over the Bering Strait were, first things first, probably intercepted by American aircraft, but if they weren't, their targets were likely American installations in Alaska and northern Canada, which would have been particularly susceptible to bombers in that region, especially since the area had already been an active war zone. That being said, there are some key differences between the nuclear weapons in Fallout and the nuclear weapons in real life, and if you'd like to learn about some of those differences, I'll leave a link up here to a pretty old video, but still pretty accurate video, about those differences and how the weapons in Fallout are fundamentally different from the strategic weapons deployed here in real life. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think I'm right about my assessment of where these bombs came from and the sequence of events on that faithful day, or do you think these weapons are from a different delivery system altogether? Let me know down below in the comments. And if you have anything else you'd like to see me talk about in Fallout or anywhere else in science fiction, you can also leave those down below in the comments as well. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.